Hi guys. Can you hear me? I'll just wait a couple of minutes. I guess a few people will come in late. Generally, I'm sort of open to hanging around afterwards, but unfortunately today, immediately after I finish teaching, Zubeide, my wife, has a class online, and we've got a baby, so I'm going to have to. She's been looking at him after him this afternoon, and I'm going to have to run off and look after Ali Jan. So I'll have to finish exactly on time on Tuesdays. Let me just wait for a few more minutes, and then I'll get started. Is there any questions from last class about the syllabus or about, before we get started, does anyone have any? Can you hear me? Like in this afternoon, I was teaching on, I'm doing another class and people had problems with my connection. I realized that I had Skype open in the background. That may have caused some bandwidth problems. So I've now closed that. But if there are problems with my voice, not just having an English accent, you know, but you might be like, Hodjem, you've got this English accent, it's horrible, please don't. If you've got some problems with the connection, let me know, and I'll switch to my phone's internet, which is better. But I think it's okay at the moment, yeah? Yeah. Okay, but let me know if there are any problems. Okay, so I'm just going to jump straight in though. Feel free to kind of interrupt me at any point. This is a philosophy class. It's a sort of discussion class. For those of you from kind of psychology or linguistics, I guess you're like, where's the PowerPoint? And I don't like PowerPoint. I can see why people use PowerPoint. But I think PowerPoint can be quite, it forces you to think in a certain type of way. And if you're only doing stuff with PowerPoint, I think it kind of narrows your way of thinking. After the Gulf War, after the invasion of second Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, trying to explain why everything went so horribly wrong. One of the high up generals said the big problem, I think the head of the army said that the problem was that they mistook a PowerPoint presentation for a plan. And I think there's something to that. I think if it can fit into PowerPoint, maybe it oversimplifies things. Yeah, so I don't use PowerPoint. I do sometimes give handouts, but I haven't got any handouts for this week. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is I want to work through the rest of the article by Heil. It's fairly introductory, but I just want to, and I hope you've all read it. I guess it's not that difficult, but I just wanted to kind of go through it in class. I think even if you understood it, sometimes repetition is good. It's good for your memory. Reading it and then hearing about it in class, it means that you're more likely to remember it. Also, there's a bunch of stuff I want to point out about the article and how it relates to other things. So I'm going to start in section 4.7. Did everyone read this now? Hands if you read it. You've read the whole article. Hands up. I read it. I'm a good student. If you haven't read it, you're a bit behind. Start reading. It's not. I don't think it's too difficult. And we're also going to tomorrow. We're going to talk about the chapter by Ryle. So I want you to have read that by class tomorrow. And because it's a philosophy class, how it works is we kind of talk about the text we've read. And when we're doing it face to face, hopefully we'll be, if you guys keep up with the reading, it won't just be me talking. We can kind of discuss things together. And I think especially face to face, I think I'm hoping that on Thursdays we'll be having discussions. So I just want to run through the second half of Heil's chapter now. Chapter 4.7, section 4.7 is important because philosophy, we've got this distinction between philosophical behaviorism and psychological behaviorism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And philosophical, as I suggested last week, is philosophical behaviorism is a sort of position that is motivated by concerns in the philosophy of language. Yeah, and the philosophical behaviorists aren't trying to give an, as next week we'll be looking at identity theory, and identity theorists are offering an account of what, for example, mental states are. Yeah, we've got words to refer to mental states, they think, and then identity theory is offering an account of what, not about the meaning of words like pain or belief. So they're not attempting to offer an account of analysis. They're not analyzing concepts. They're trying to offer an account of what mental states are. The philosophical behaviorists, though, see themselves or saw themselves as basically offering an account of the meaning of expressions containing mentalistic language. Yeah, and this, you may have heard of analytic philosophy. Yeah, this is why philosophical behaviorism is a type of analytic philosophy in the kind of old school sense, in that they think they're offering analysis of certain types of expression. So behaviorists typically held that assertions concerning states of mind could be translated or analyzed into statements about behavior or dispositions to behave. So the behaviorists have this idea that you can translate without any loss of meaning, yeah, from a mentalistic vocabulary to a vocabulary that doesn't involve any mentalistic language. Yeah. So this is really what the project of philosophical behaviorism is. And yeah, so the states of mind could be paraphrased or analyzed into talks of behavior. Yeah, well, what the behaviorists are offering isn't an account of what pain is, but they're offering an analysis of the concept of pain. Yeah, what do we mean when we say someone is in pain? What we mean when someone is in pain is just that they have a certain type of disposition. They're disposed to scream. They have a disposition to cry. Yeah. So the behaviorists, at least kind of as they're understood today, are understood as engaged in this project of conceptual analysis. And next week and the week afterwards, both the identity theorists and the functionalists sort of reject this. They make a distinction that both identity theorists and the functionalists, in some sense, buy into Frege's distinction between sense and reference. Yeah, and both the identity theory and functionalists don't think they're offering a conceptual analysis of the concept of pain. What they're offering is an account of what pain is. That didn't make sense to you now. Don't worry, that's going to be one of the topics we're going to be looking at next week. Okay. Someone sent me a direct message saying my bandwidth is problematic. Is that the case for everyone? Yeah. So listen, you're really bad students. I said, listen, if my voice quality is bad, tell me. And only one person did. Thank you, Muaz. Yeah, everyone else was just like, yeah. I mean, if the sound quality is bad, let me know and I'll change. Okay, I'm going to do it now. This may take. Done. Hello? Okay, am I back? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes, you are back.
Okay, and is the quality any better?
I mean, I think not.
Yeah, it's
Ah.
better.
Is it better or not? I'm just wondering, or is it still problematic?
It is better, I believe.
Okay, let me know if it's problematic still, and I'll maybe change my headphones or the microphone if it's okay. Should I try changing the sound settings?
No, that's okay. I think. I mean, it wasn't that problematic at the end. At the beginning for me, probably that's why it doesn't. It didn't get better.
Okay.
For me.
Okay. So let me know again, and I'll see what I can do. But okay, yeah. So the first thing that's sort of important about behaviorism is that what the behaviorists seem to be offering is something like conceptual analysis. They're interested in analyzing the mentalistic language, and they've got this claim about translatability. That all statements, if we have this analytic identity, if we claim we're offering a behavioristic analysis, we're basically making a claim about translatability, that it's possible to offer a translation of all sentences using mentalistic vocabulary into sentences not using such a vocabulary. And then we can do that by saying, well, there's a sort of paraphrase we can give of these sentences purely in terms of dispositions. Yeah. And the sort of thought is that, there's in economics, people will talk about the average family. The average family has 2.5 children. So there's a family out there with 2.5 children. No. When we talk about the average family, we're not committed to the existence of a family. Yep. We can translate talk of the average family into talk of individual families. We take each individual family, we count how many children there are, and then we divide by the number. Yeah. So we've got a kind of way of translating talk of average families into talk about individual families. We've got some sort of rules. Yeah. So when we say that the average family has 2.5 children, we're not committed to any sort of entity, and we can get rid of talk of an average family. We can talk about the number of children, or we can talk about the number of families, the number of children, and then we just divide the number of children by the number of families. Yeah, or the average income. Now, if the behaviorist is offering a reductive analysis, yeah, if really what they're doing, these philosophical behaviorists, is what they're trying to do is philosophy of language, then it seems that this, understood as part of the philosophy of language as an account of the meaning of psychological terms, it seems like it's just not going to work. Yeah, and I take it the biggest problem. So what's the problem that they point to at the end of this section? So I think this is one nagging worry is that behavioral analyses threaten to be open-ended. What do we mean by that? Why might a behavioral analysis of any of these mental state terms threaten to be open-ended?
Because you can make up anything to explain anything post hoc. So I mean, there is infinite possibility that you can say that is the disposition of doing X, etc. Isn't that the worry?
Well, I think you've got the worry, but you haven't done a very good job of expressing it. Yeah. Anyone else? I mean, yes, I think you're right, but I think anyone think they can express this sort of worry in? Asnan?
I mean, I'm not sure if this was one you were talking about, but there was some mention of like how do we define one behavior? Like, how do we say these two behaviors are the same and these two results are the same? This is also a problematic issue. But I think it was a criticism about philosophical behaviorism. So now I remember. I don't know.
Yeah. This is what we're looking at now. This sort of analytic behaviorism is, I take it, this is philosophical behaviorism. Yeah. And I think that's sort of getting closer. I think the only thing missing from your account is a sort of illustration. Yeah, so could you illustrate that?
Me?
Yeah.
Like in the chapter, it gave the example like the rat pushing a lever when a light is coming, like, and it can push the button with its nose or paw or with something else. And I mean, we could all say that this behavior is a pushing behavior, but it's actually they're different behaviors. So maybe like,
yeah, so here, like, let's you're right, this is in the discussion of psychological behaviorism, but we can apply the same sort of worry to philosophical behaviorism. So, let's say the desire for food is to be understood as a disposition to behave in certain ways. Well, it could be a disposition to push a lever, it could be a disposition to stand on a thing. This desire understood as a disposition to engage in certain types of bodily motion, it's sort of open-ended. There's so many things that could count as an expression. Fagun and then Enver.
Yeah, I think this is like, since they're like stimulus and response, and the response can vary, but also the stimulus is never coming in its like isolated place. So there's never just one stimulus, but there's like perhaps there's like a beer, but then there's this like the disposition to be courageous or disposition to fear of it, and you cannot really know it until you give the response, and then we can define like which types of dispositions these people had in terms of responses.
Yeah, I think that's right. Once again, very abstract. It would be cool if you could kind of illustrate it with sort of concrete examples, because I think to get across these sort of worries, the best way of doing it is, can you think of any particular concrete?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, so until if I think that we are not in a laboratory or something, that I'm just like in my natural environment, I am like, for example, I don't know, just like, but I'm trying to see find an example where I have like more than just one inclinations to do something. For example, I may just like respond to a phone call, but for my desire, my disposition to respond to a phone call could be that I'm responsible, or just like I cannot resist the urge, or it may be just that I'm already expecting a phone call, or it may be just that I'm just trying to shut it up. I don't know. There's like too many dispositions, and I don't know what it is.
So I think one thing there, like the case example you're giving, I guess you've got context dependency as well. So like, for example, you may want to respond to a phone call, but how that manifests itself in behavior or the disposition is going to be quite different, say, if the phone goes off when you're in class, or if the phone goes off when you're at home, or if the phone goes off when you're sitting in a metro. So you've got the same mental state, and it can lead to different types of behavior in different contexts. Yeah. If you want to go to the toilet, if you're just at home, you'll sit. If you're in class and you're a little kid, you put your hand in the air. So the desire to go to the toilet is a disposition to go to the toilet, or in certain contexts to put your hand in the air. And then once you start thinking, well, you've got to, in your translation, you're going to end up with these huge open-ended lists of situations, contexts, and behavior. Enver and then Atesh, and then I'll move on.
Actually, what I was going to say was exactly the same as yours. I was going to say that on the other end, behavior are extremely context dependent. which makes it hard to tie them to mental states, because then we would have a very wide range of sort of like symptoms, sort of like tells to tie them to a certain mental state. For example, if we talk about the behavior of being angry, the behavior of being angry in a class and the behavior of being angry in your own home is quite different. And behavior of being angry in class might resemble another mental state in another context, in a different context. So this is
Yeah, so that's
it is sort of like it suffers the same problems of diagnostics, but even more, because we are not sure that we can tie them.
No, I think that the anger is a good one, because it manifests itself very differently. And so, like, we've talked about pain, we've talked about beliefs and desires. If you're a behaviorist, you're also going to want to kind of cash out language about emotions in terms of dispositions. And once again, like on the surface, you might say, oh, anger just is a disposition to act aggressively, maybe. Yep. But then when you start trying to cash it out in ways that aren't circular, that don't appeal to mental states, just purely in terms of behavior, the context dependence, because in a philosophy class, people could express their anger in very subtle sorts of ways. And if you want a full analysis of anger, you're going to have to include all of those possibilities, and it just seems to be open-ended. Yeah. So I think that being open-ended, but I also think the context dependency is important. And Atesh, you had something to add?
So I wonder if this context dependency case is the real worry philosophically, because for instance, a context of an experiment, a psychologist may isolate the stimuli in the environment, and then and just look at the stimulus which is changing. So I believe there is in the philosophical case there has to be another worry than the context dependency. I wanted to ask a question.
So I think the open-endedness and context dependency are separate, I think. But I think one reason for the open-endedness is context dependency. And I think context dependency is important. Yeah, I think within psychology that you have psychologists often use sort of operational definitions, and these can really be quite problematic for these sorts of reasons. I think Ganesh, who's in psychology? Do you know Ganesh in psychology? So he, I've talked to him about this. I think he's got a paper about this, about depression. So they operationally define depression as kind of, oh, the rat spends less time fighting against drowning. So they give this operational depression of which is so kind of context tied, because you throw a rat into water and you see how long it takes to drown. And if you give it drugs and it fights for longer, it's like, oh, we've got an antidepressant in rats. So once you try and take these things outside of the lab, you get problems of you have a sort of an operational definition that is very narrow, and then in different contexts it doesn't necessarily apply. So I think the project of operational definitions is in some sense tied to the same sort of spirit as this philosophical behaviorist spirit. Ozan and then Hasnun, and then I want to move on, but this is quite fun. So
would it be right to think that there are two problems, and one is different mental states can manifest as the same behavior, and also the same mental state can manifest as different behaviors, like two-way?
I think both. We've got both of those problems in terms of the relationship between. And I take it one thing is that the behaviorists want to be conservative in a certain sense. we have our mentalistic vocabulary, we know how to use it. And they're not suggesting that we replace the notion of pain with some other notion, that is well defined. So one thing would be, well, we should just get rid of mentalistic language and replace it with this kind of behavioristic language. But that's not what they're doing. They think they're able to offer a translation from our everyday common sense, pre-philosophical mentalistic language to behavioral language. And then, when you've got these problems going both ways, it's a sort of problem. Okay, Hasnun, and then Hesna hasn't said anything, so I'll.
I want to say that I think the arguments of behaviorism is really important in terms of their courage about saying things opposite to the Cartesian view, which is like all over the place, and still it's really is influential in our world. But to tell that the rejection of dualism between mind and body do not really have to tie to the rejection of mental activity at all, or mental activity as I think they are both just we all human are just trying to find the answer of what makes us different than those animals. But one of them tells that we are so superior, and another one does tell that we are just we are also applied. We are also tied with those deterministic rules, etc. But the both of them is just ignoring the fact that our mind is our mental activities are literally tied to our body and our environment, and the behavior of us is so variable than most of the animals. And
so I think
it's and this difference should not be superiority, and they cannot tell that, I think.
Well, I mean, I think some of these philosophical behaviorists, as it's become kind of the canonical version of it, is such that in some sense it wants to deny the sort of mental, in some sense say that we can replace this mentalistic talk with bodily behavioral talk without any loss of meaning. I take it though that the behaviorist I sort of like Ryle, he wants to in some sense expand the notion of behavior, so that the behavior itself, the embodied behavior, has mental characteristics. And I think that sort of view is a sort of view that it's not really attempting to replace the mental with non-mental language. So when we talk about Ryle, I think the sort of position here that's known as philosophical behaviorism, when we look at Ryle, I think Ryle himself doesn't necessarily buy into that. Before we, Hasnan, you had one more thing, but then say what you want to say, and then I want to move on.
Sure. I was just gonna say that I mean, I think I don't think the context dependency is why the open-endedness is a problem, because context dependency is a case in everything, but and context dependency only implies more complexity rather than open-endedness. But I think why it is a problem is because I think it makes it circular. Like for example, if something happens, like behavior and response, a stimulus and response, or stimulus and behavior, if you analyze it like that, for example, if you put someone in electricity and then they act differently than normally, then you may also call that, if they laugh, you may say that this is a pain reaction, but then you're not tying the connection between stimulus and response is so arbitrary that I think this is why it is open-ended. It is also context about context dependency, but I think it is also because the boundaries of which behavior is what, I think this is what the
so the open-endedness and context dependency, of course, you can separate them. I actually think context dependency is a really big problem, and not just for the behaviorist. I think it turns out it's going to be a really big problem for the functionalist, the computational view of mind. And I don't know if you've heard of the frame problem. And this is a classic problem for computational, in robotics and the like. That the intelligent behavior is context dependent. And the big problem with artificial intelligence is dealing with this. Yeah. So yeah, if you're interested, do a search for the frame problem. Yeah, which is a form of context dependent, which is basically that if you've got something that's representing the world, that there's a whole bunch of stuff we don't need to worry about. Yeah. But whenever we change, the whole context changes, and that we're quite able to deal with this with recognizing context. Yeah, but it's very difficult to program something to be able to understand context. So this is, I think, one of the problems with artificial language. Yeah, that within a context, you've got systems that can work quite well, but yeah. So yeah, the frame problem is a problem about context. And I think problems about context are really quite problematic for this behaviorism, but it's going to turn out they're also really problematic for computational accounts as well. And I think this idea of being open-ended is separate, but I do think that context is one important reason for the open-endedness. I'm tempted to think that all of these problems, in some sense, can be explained in terms of the problem of context, and so maybe there's just this one problem. But I wouldn't want to put money on that. If I was a betting man, I wouldn't put. But that's my sort of hunch, is that when it comes down to it, all of these problems can be cashed out. And so if we could solve the problem of context, maybe all of these other context sensitivity. Now, talking about, we've got the open-endedness. I take it the second big problem is that and this is also, I think, a problem of context in some sense. It's not a problem of external context, but it's a problem of internal context. So the relationship between an individual mental state and behavior is dependent on two types of context. We might think of it as kind of inner context and outer context. Yeah, but what you do and are disposed to do evidently depends upon your overall state of mind. So the way in which a particular belief manifests itself in behavior depends upon the other beliefs you have and the desires you have. Yeah, so, you know, if someone points a gun at you, you run away. Unless you want to be killed. So some people do like suicide by cop. Yep, so how you react in certain situations is going to depend upon your other mental states. And I think for the analytic philosophical behaviorists, this is a real problem, because they want to offer an account of how to translate claims about mental states into a language that doesn't have mentalistic vocabulary. Yeah, but it looks like if you want to say what the belief that there's a bear in the vicinity out there is, yeah, that how this affects your behavior is going to depend upon the sort of desires on your other mental states. Yeah, and I take it this worry about what you do and are disposed to do depends evidently on your overall state of mind. This is one of the kind of big motivations that gets you from behaviorism to functionalism, because functionalism is going to explain the individuation conditions of particular mental states of beliefs and desires in terms of their relations to other mental states. Finally, I just want to say one more thing about this relation to behavior. That these sort of behaviorist accounts explain the relation between the mental and behavior in purely causal terms. So these sort of dispositions are to be understood in causal terms. Yeah, one state causing another. I think an alternative is to understand the relationship between mental states, not in causal terms, but in normative terms. Yeah, so if you've got a certain belief in a certain desire, this tells you how you ought to behave. If you believe P, and if you believe if P, then Q, this means that you should believe Q. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily. So when we move on through the semester, that when it comes to these sort of models of mental states and the relationship between the mental and the physical, that the sort of behaviorism we're seeing here is saying it's a causal relationship, yeah, between the mental and the physical. I think that Ryle, when we look at Ryle's account, I think his account is more normative. Yeah, so he's quite happy using sort of normative notions in his overall account. So the notions of skills and of knowing how. Yeah, I take it that notions of skills, notions of knowing how, are not purely causal notions. Yeah, they will involve certain causal capacities. Yeah, but yeah. So this is. I just realized that I'm running out of time. Oh, Ozan.
Are they always? Do they always include normativity? Because like in things like, if you get stabbed, you scream because you believe you're in, like, how does that work?
Yeah. So. Yeah. So. The Heil is talking about beliefs. So when we talk about mental states, there's a whole bunch of different things we talk about. Heil is now focusing on beliefs and desires. That we also, I think the original behaviorists and in the kind of 50s and 60s, really the examples they were giving had to do with sensations. So that when we read Ryle, when we read Smart, they're talking about pain. I guess the relationship between pain and between sensations and their expression, we might think of, yeah, that's quite possibly causal. When I was talking about normative accounts, I was talking more about the relationship between beliefs and desires and behavior, rather than the relation between sensations and desires. And I think today there's a bunch of so one of the big schools of thought when it comes to concepts and beliefs and what they are is a view called inferentialism. And inferentialism is a bit like functionalism. And when we come to functionalism, I'll say a bit more about that. But functionalism, as we see it, is once again that we've got these various mental states, and then there are these sort of causal relationships between them. And inferentialism basically says that beliefs are individuated in terms of their inferential roles. And inferential roles are not purely causal relations between beliefs, but they're normative relations. Yeah. So the relationship between one set of beliefs and another belief is going to be a normative, not a purely causal relation. So you've got a set of beliefs. Yeah. You know, all men are mortal. I'm a man. There's a set of beliefs, two beliefs. Yeah. Then you've got the belief I am mortal. Now you may not believe that. Yeah. But so the relationship between beliefs, at the very least, it's not purely causal. There's this sort of normative side to it. And so I think one thing about these sort of behaviorism about beliefs is that this sort of 50s behaviorism and 60s behaviorism. So in the 60s, there are a bunch of philosophers who then took this behaviorist picture of things like pain. Pain is a disposition to scream or whatever you want, and then try to tie it to beliefs. they want to offer a kind of purely causal sort of account of the relation. And I think if you're going to have a view like this, there are going to be some problems with this. So you got people like David Armstrong. I don't know if you come across him. He tries to offer a sort of dispositional view of belief in the 1960s. Okay, so this is philosophical behaviorism. Its goal is to offer an account of conceptual analysis, and it's trying to give an analysis of our everyday language, mentalistic language, in non-mentalistic terms. Yeah, and we're going to contrast this next week with identity theory. That it's very explicit about we're not doing conceptual analysis. Yeah, and this was a big move. Now, as I just suggested, that in the original kind of behaviorists, or the people who are taking, that they're more interested in states like pain. That I take it by the sort of 50s and 60s, it turns out that the paradigm example of the mental has moved from sensations, things like pain, to things like beliefs and desires. So there's this sort of move from the 50s and 60s where people are interested in offering an account of sensations, to the kind of 70s and 80s and 90s where people are interested in offering an account of what's known as propositional attitudes, things like beliefs and desires. And it seems to me that it seems much easier to offer an account of propositional attitudes in terms of something like behaviorism, than it is something like pain. Because I take it the problem with these accounts is that they sort of get rid of the intrinsic nature of these events. So I'm going to jump to section 4.10, and I'm going to talk a bit about intrinsic characteristics. So who read this? This is so this is a useful bit of terminology. So philosophers make a distinction between two types of properties. Yeah, intrinsic and extrinsic. Yeah, and the extrinsic we might think of it as relational. Yeah, we might some people think of extrinsic properties as sort of relational. We can think of the intrinsic as the non-relational. Yeah, so I think often when people think about mental states, especially sensations, we think of sensations having something like an intrinsic qualitative nature. Yeah, there's something what it's like to feel pain. Yeah, it seems though that behaviorist accounts and also functionalist account, their account seems to be purely extrinsic. Yeah, so if you look, dispositions are extrinsic properties. It's got to do with your relationship to other things. Yeah, so he says, let me just read this to get it across. My speaking of intrinsic qualitative nature might lead you to wonder what exactly this phrase is supposed to signify. The notion of an intrinsic quality is best understood in contrast to the complementary notion of an extrinsic characteristic. Yeah, an intrinsic quality is a quality an object has in its own right. So we might think that being spherical is an intrinsic quality of a billiard ball. Yeah, it's a property something has. We can forget about all the other things around it. We can forget about the context. Yeah, and the shape of something is something that you can attribute to the thing independently of the sort of relations it stands in. Yeah. Extrinsic qualities or extrinsic characteristics are properties that things have in virtue of the relation these things stand to other objects. And I take it the sort of thought is that the dispositional properties are extrinsic. Enver.
How exactly is this different from necessary qualities and accidental qualities?
Well, I mean, so like, for example, I can be happy, but my being happy may be, or I may be in pain. Yeah, and my being in pain, that may be kind of an intrinsic quality I have, irregardless of how, because like I've got my mental state, and then the sort of idea is that the behavior that results as a result of this mental state. Yep. And the behavior that results depends partly on what exists outside. Yeah. So the behavior, the external behavior I engage in isn't intrinsic. Yeah. But you might think that my pain is a contingent property I have. So I'm not necessarily in pain. Unless, I don't know, maybe you've I've got a broken soul, I'm Russian, you know, my being is to suffer, you know, we're human beings, we're fallen, and I don't know. But you might think, yeah, being in pain is not necessary, is it?
Okay, so humans, things with cognitive capacity, can have intrinsic but contingent properties. But do just things that don't have any cognitive capacity have any intrinsic but contingent properties? Like does a billiard ball have intrinsic but contingent properties?
Yeah, so I mean, some people, like people who are known as structural realists, think that there are no physical intrinsic properties, that all physical properties are extrinsic. Yeah, so you've got people like James Ladyman at Bristol. Yeah, and they defend this, what's known as structural realism, which is all physical properties are extrinsic, because all physical properties are relational, because all you've got in physics are forces. Yeah. Now, you might take a view like that and combine it with the idea that mental properties are intrinsic. So you've got these, and this is a view some people have, yeah, where the physical properties are all extrinsic, they're all relational, yeah, that when you do physics, you don't come to know anything about things in themselves. You don't come to know what an atom is in itself. You just come to know about its relations to things around it. And all you've got is a complex web of relations. That's all you get in physics. But we come to know our own suffering intrinsically. This is a view that at the end of the article by Feigl, that it looks like Feigl's identity theory could push you into that position. He ends up rejecting a view like this. But when we look at what Feigl's position, the one thing you might think of when you read Feigl and you read the end of his paper is, oh, it looks like all physical properties are extrinsic, but it looks like maybe that through subjective experience that we come to know something about the intrinsic properties of matter. Yeah, so when I look at your brain from the outside as a scientist, do I get to know anything about what it is in itself? No, but your experience of your own states. Ozan. Sorry.
So is there a difference between saying like our pain is intrinsic to us or we can know our pain intrinsically? Because when you first gave the billiard ball example, and it felt almost trivial that, like, of course, my pain isn't necessary to me in the way that, you know, being a sphere is necessary for the billiard ball.
So I take it the sort of thought is that, oh, sorry, there's a bit of, I've got to go very quickly because my wife is about to teach and needs the computer, and I need to look after Ali-Jan. We just had a baby. He's very cute. Yeah. Oh, you can bring him very quickly. Yeah. Yeah. So the sort of thought is that that accounts in terms of dispositions is purely in terms of the causal powers. But normally we think the causal powers of objects depend upon their intrinsic nature. So the billiard ball has the power and disposition to roll because it's spherical. So we think that it's because of the intrinsic nature of something that it has the causal powers that it does. Yeah. Now, this is a view that the identity theorist is going to say yes, that they're going to basically take this account of that all you're getting in behaviorism is dispositional properties, extrinsic properties, but that human minds do have intrinsic properties. There are these inner states that are the grounds of these causal powers, but these inner states, these intrinsic properties that ground the causal powers, are not psychological states, but they're physical states. The human being has the cause dispositions it does because its brain is in a certain state. Yeah, and so this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic, this is something that next week when we look at the identity theorists, they're going to buy into this distinction, say that the behaviorist is only giving you extrinsic qualities. There are intrinsic properties that ground the causal powers, but the intrinsic properties are going to be states of the brain. A sort of defender of a certain type of dualism might also say the same sort of thing, but say the intrinsic properties are the felt subjective states. Yeah, and all physical properties are extrinsic. This is the sort of view that you find amongst people, for example, who are attracted to panpsychism. Anyway, I've got to run. I've got to take over Alijan. I'll see you tomorrow in class.
See you. Here's the transition.
Oops. Say hello. Oh. Isn't he cute? Okay, I'll see you in class tomorrow.
Thank you so much. See you.
Oh, is that a hand or that?
Can I tell something before you go?
Yeah.
I mean, I was also trying to. I mean, you mentioned panpsychism, and I was also thinking about them. That if we can ascribe minds to anything that behave intelligently, behavior said that. So we do not need to consider mental capacities of beings because they are just irrelevant to our behaviors, etc. But this argument is can also mean that we can ascribe mind to anything that acts intelligently. So they all everything has mind.
Yeah.
So
one thing I've got to run, but I'll just say very quickly that, I take it that when we think about mind, the people in this literature, there are two things they're often talking about. They're talking about intelligence and they're talking about consciousness. I take it, and normally there's this sort of idea that they somehow go together. I take it though that panpsychism sort of cuts off the consciousness from the intelligence. So you're going to have consciousness everywhere. So not all consciousness is intelligent. Yeah. That I take it the kind of standard more traditional view says that consciousness and intelligence, some sort of intelligence, sort of go together, and so they come together as a sort of double act. If you get one, you get the other. It seems to me that panpsychism, in some sense, decouples questions about consciousness from questions about intelligence. Yeah. So consciousness is going to be spread out everywhere. Intelligence is going to emerge. Yep, and understanding the emergence of intelligence, we can totally separate that from questions about consciousness, because there's no emergence of consciousness. Yeah, because consciousness is just, there may be kind of consciousness gets stuck together, and as we get more complex systems, we get more complex consciousness. But there's no interesting scientific question about the emergence of consciousness. I take it that the interesting scientific question is going to be about the emergence of intelligence, but we can study that without thinking about consciousness. But we're not talking about panpsychism this semester, even though it's
Yeah.
sort of, but that's more like philosophy of mind rather than philosophy of cognitive science.
I mean, I always think in
Yeah,
a way that.
I need to go because my wife
Okay.
is using this computer for her class. So I'll see you all tomorrow.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Hocam, are you going to
Thank you.
upload this recording on Moodle?
Yeah, I will.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Ciao.